Recently, I was talking to a teacher who said that she liked my old videos because I was more energetic. So I thought I'd try something different. I'd try standing up. Same shelf, just me standing up. Let's see how this works. But first, let's give a quick shout out to St. Charles West High School, home of the Warriors in Missouri, Miss Perkinson's class, which I hear that this towel can ward off the wrath of Perkinson. Woo! Let's see how it works. You know, I hear she can get kind of cranky come exam time. What I'd like to do today is really kind of annotate something. People have said they want to hear a little more about the Enlightenment. So I'm thinking let's start off at the very beginning with Immanuel Kant's essay from 1784, What is Enlightenment? Now, what you've got to realize is that people who were Enlightenment philosophers, they were conscious of their movement. It wasn't like the Byzantine Empire where nobody actually called it that and people called it that later. But these were people who knew that they were doing something special, and they knew that what they were doing was enlightenment. They called it enlightenment. But nobody had thought to go back and think about, okay, what is it? So in 1784, I mean, Voltaire's about to die at this point. The Enlightenment has been going, but Kant, Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, thinks, you know what? This whole Enlightenment thing is worth stating exactly what it is. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read this and kind of, give my commentary here and there, almost as if I'm actively reading the document. And for those of you who are students, might want to note here my annotations, that I'm not just highlighting stuff. I'm actually writing down what it means so it'll stick in my head. So let's hear what Kant has to say. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage. Nonage is the ability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This nonage is self-imposed if its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Sapere aude, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. Now, this word nonage, non-age, okay, this is almost like being underage, but not in a literal sense, kind of like if Fatima and Vivi are going to the club and the bouncer says, look, you are not old enough, non-age, okay, this is not going to work. But this is sort of an intellectual immaturity. We can all think of people in our lives who have never questioned anything once that somebody else told them, that they believe everything an authority says, whether that be a secular authority or a religious authority, that every thought that ever comes into their brain originated from somewhere else. And this is a state of nonage, a state of either inability or just indecision to think for yourself, that you're just going to go along with what other people are telling you. Now, when he says sapere aude, dare to know, of course, the Latin language at this time, still the preferred scholarly language, and, a little bit of humanism leftovers. But when he says here, have the courage to use your own understanding, I think it's worth noting here that this is a bit at odds with the Bible. If you think about it, if you know the Bible, compare this to Proverbs 3:5, which reads, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Now, counter to this, Kant says, have the courage to use your own understanding. So Kant is really firing a broadside at traditional Christianity, at least as far as the institutional church and the values that are there. Now, of course, remember that the Enlightenment places itself against these authorities, both religious and secular, which enlightened philosophers believed kept people in a state of nonage. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large part of mankind gladly remain minors all their lives, long after nature has freed them from external guidance. Now, note here the mention of nature. That's another thing about enlightenment, that there is a big emphasis on nature and the natural order of things. And this idea that the world that existed in Europe at that time was somehow unnatural, that this world turned people into people other than what nature intended them to be because of these institutional structures that hold people back. They are the reasons why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet, and so on, then I have no need to exert myself. I have no need to think. If I can only pay, others will take care of that disagreeable business for me. Those guardians who have kindly taken supervision upon themselves see to it that the overwhelming majority of mankind, among them the entire fair sex, should consider the step to maturity not only as hard, but as extremely dangerous. Now, note here that Kant is actually making a note of what's happened to women and what society has done to oppress women, whereas other philosophers such as Rousseau pretty much justified traditional gender roles. So you see here where Kant is questioning this idea that women should, in particular, should remain in this state of nonage. First, these guardians make their domestic cattle stupid and carefully prevent the docile creatures from taking a single step without the leading strings to which they have fastened them. Then they show them the danger that would threaten them if they should try to walk by themselves. Now this danger is not very great. After stumbling a few times, they would at least learn to walk. However, examples of such failures intimidate and generally discourage all further attempts. So these guardians, as Kant puts it, these authorities who say, look, this person tried to think for themselves, look what happened. That didn't turn out so well. You don't want to think for yourself. It is dangerous. And indeed, just like anything that you would do, whether it is a sport that you're taking up or any kind of thing that requires practice, you are going to fail at first. Thinking for yourself is kind of like a sport. It's something that you must practice at in order to get better. Thus, it is very difficult for the individual to work himself out of the nonage, which has become almost second nature to him. He has even grown to like it, and is at first really incapable of using his own understanding, because he has never been permitted to try it. Dogmas and formulas, these mechanical tools designed for reasonable use, or rather abuse, of his natural gifts, are the fetters of an everlasting nonage. So note that this nonage is something to which we are conditioned. And we see here that, these dogmas, these formulas, these things that have been taught to you, and you're told that follow these rules and you'll be fine. These are things that he says are abusing the human being's natural gifts. So once again, we see here, what is it that we could be? What is it that nature created us to be? And what are we? Are we living up to that potential? The man who casts them off would make an uncertain leap over the narrowest ditch because he is not used to such free movement. That is why there are only a few men who walk firmly and who have emerged from nonage by cultivating their own minds. This brings forth some imagery of Plato's allegory of the cave, where the people are sitting there and they're looking at the cave wall and they're seeing shadows and they're identifying things and they're like, oh, that's that, that's that. Now, if their heads are turned to the actual fire, Or if they are brought outside the cave to see the sun, they don't want to do that. You know, it's kind of like when your parents flip the light on, the overhead light in the morning when you've been sleeping and you're like, oh, you know, eventually your eyes get used to the light. But that does not happen initially. And so oftentimes people may try to think for themselves and they fail in that attempt, and they are intimidated from taking up the courage to think for themselves, again, as nature intended for them to do. It is more nearly possible, however, for the public to enlighten itself indeed. If it is only given freedom, enlightenment is almost inevitable. Now note here the emphasis on freedom. So what we've looked at so far is the emphasis on nature. Second, the emphasis on freedom, that this is the only thing that's really necessary for enlightenment. There will always be a few independent thinkers, even among the self-appointed guardians of the multitude. Once such men have thrown off the yoke of nonage, they will spread about them the spirit of a reasonable appreciation of man's value and his duty to think for himself. Now note here man as valuable, okay? That not only that he has the ability to think for himself, but he has a duty. And man is valuable rather than man as sinful, rather than man as degraded, rather than man as lower. Man has value. Woman has value too. This is the 21st century. This translation is a bit old, admittedly. This enlightenment requires nothing but freedom, and the most innocent of all that may be called freedom. Freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. Note, public use. Freedom to express yourself and what you're thinking in public. Now, I hear the cry from all sides, do not argue, the officer says. Do not argue, drill. The tax collector, do not argue, pay. The pastor, do not argue, believe. Only one ruler in the world says, argue as much as you please, but obey. So here we see all of the authorities saying, do not argue, do what we tell you. The pastor who says, believe. Doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense to you, if it seems unnatural to you, if there's not enough evidence for you to believe it. Believe because that's what we told you. Now, of course, then there is Frederick the Great. And Kant is saying that, look, Frederick the Great says, argue as much as you like, but obey. Now, that's the spirit of enlightened absolutism, of which I've got a video available if you want to know more about that. But discuss all you'd like, but don't disobey me, because then things will get really ugly really quickly. But at least express yourself as much as you please. We find restrictions on freedom everywhere. But which restriction is harmful to enlightenment? Which restriction is innocent? And which advances enlightenment? I reply, the public use of one's reason must be free at all times. And this alone can bring enlightenment to mankind. Now, of course, we have debates going on today about what should people be able to say in public. A lot of European countries have banned certain forms of hate speech, which are legal in the United States. And people ask, why is it in the United States that people are allowed to say these hateful things in public? Well, this goes back to the foundation of the American Bill of Rights, which is founded on Enlightenment principles, that the public use of one's reason must be uninhibited, whether that be speech, press, religion, assembly, petition. And people question these values today, and of course, enlightened philosophers would say, please do question these values. But the root of these values and the freedom of expression, the free and complete, uninhibited expression of the human being, has its roots in the Enlightenment. A man may postpone his own enlightenment, but only for a limited period of time. Sounds like an advertisement or something. For a limited time only. And to give up enlightenment altogether, either for oneself or one's descendants, is to violate and to trample upon the sacred rights of man. So far we have seen nature, we have seen freedom, and then the rights of man, the sacred rights of man. That if there's anything in the world that is sacred, it is not religious doctrine, religious dogma. It is not unproven truth. It is the freedom of people to do what they choose to do. And in some senses, that kind of goes back to Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man, when he talks about how what makes mankind different and greater than any other creation, even the angels, is that free will. So in some senses, we see here that the Enlightenment is a continuation of Renaissance humanism. It's no accident that Kant was speaking in Latin earlier. So we see that there is no separation. There is no gulf between human dignity and human freedom. That there is no dignity without freedom. That the rights of man are a sacred thing and are not to be touched. When we ask, are we now living in an enlightened age? The answer is no. But we live in an age of enlightenment. As matters now stand, it is still far from true that men are already capable of using their own reason in religious matters confidently and correctly without external guidance. Still, we have some obvious indications that the field of working toward the goal of religious truth is now opened. What is more, the hindrances against general enlightenment or the emergence from self-imposed nonage are gradually diminishing. In this respect, this is the age of the Enlightenment and the century of Frederick. Frederick being, of course, Frederick the Great. So, are we living in an enlightened age? No, but we are living in an age of enlightenment. Not everyone is educated, not everyone can think for themselves, but we see that there are more tools that people have to think for themselves. We see that the institutional structures that have kept people from thinking for themselves are becoming less powerful. They are becoming less robust. And we see places such as Prussia at the time that Kant was writing, where people can engage in free inquiry and there is religious toleration and a tolerance for debate, where people are experiencing a greater degree of freedom than they have in the past. That people are gravitating toward this natural order of things and they are throwing off the unnatural and all of the restrictions and all of the self-imposed nonage that comes along with it. A prince ought not to deem it beneath his dignity to state that he considers it his duty not to dictate anything to his subjects on religious matters, but to leave them to complete freedom. Fredericks Prussia is a shining example that freedom need not cause the least worry concerning public order or the unity of a community. When one does not deliberately attempt to keep men in barbarism, they will gradually work out of that condition by themselves. Now, what we see here is this whole idea that people don't need to share a religion in order to share a nationality. Now, of course, nationalism's going to come along in the next century, but Frederick is saying, look, Kant is saying, look, in Fredericks Prussia, we have religious toleration. Things have not crumbled. We are okay. And especially when he says here, when one does not deliberately attempt to keep men in barbarism, they will gradually work out that condition by themselves. Now, there is an optimism about humanity here. There is an optimism about the ability of a human being, if not held back by institutional structures and self-proclaimed guardians and authorities, that human beings can find their way. Now, of course, once again, this goes against the traditional Western Christian belief that people are fallen, that people need divine guidance, they need grace, and all of this kind of stuff. So there is an optimism about people, and of course there is no freedom without some degree of optimism about people, because when it comes down to it, if you don't think that people will generally make the right decisions, then freedom is stupid. and there's no reason to have it. So because we have faith in people's ability to do the right thing more often than not and to guide themselves, that is why this freedom should exist. That is why freedom is the natural order of things. I have emphasized the main point of the Enlightenment, man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage, primarily in religious matters, because our rulers have no interest in playing the guardian to their subjects in the arts and sciences. Above all, nonage in religion is not only the most harmful, but the most dishonorable. And if you think about that, believing something without having thought about it, something that has to do with what's beyond the world and your eternal salvation and all of that, to never contemplate that, to remain in a state of nonage about something that is potentially that important. I can see why Kant would say that that is dishonorable, not to think about it and to just take in whatever you've been told. Nature has carefully cultivated the seed within the hard core of the human mind, namely the urge for and the vocation of free thought. And this free thought gradually reacts back on the modes of thought of the people, and men become more and more capable of acting in freedom. At last, free thought acts even on the fundamentals of government, and the state finds it agreeable to treat man, who is now more than a machine, in accordance with his dignity. To treat man, who is now more than a machine, in accordance with his dignity. And that's the thing, that people are not just cogs in a wheel. People are individuals. People are individuals who by nature have the sacred right to think freely and to be free and to decide the course of their own lives. And that is enlightenment. Thinking for yourself, trusting your own capacity to judge and to understand things in your own life, whether it's about religion or anything else in philosophy, that you should be able to trust yourself. Nature has given you the right to be free. Nature has given you the intellectual capacity to be free. And so as institutions which have limited freedom continue to crumble, there is no excuse for you to remain in a state of nonage. And if you like that and you want to hear more, be sure to subscribe. TomRichey.net, social media, and all of that good stuff. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this has made you a bit more enlightened. It's always a pleasure.